So my name is Andrew Rice. I work for the University of Wisconsin at the Value Added Research Center. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction, a little bit of framing for people that aren't necessarily familiar with SLOs, although I bet everyone is familiar to some extent. But I want to recognize that we have in this room some of the foremost experts in student learning objectives. And the reason I say that is because at this point, you could, if you said, let's get a whole bunch of value-added experts in a room, you could fill up a room. But when we talk about SLO experts, there's just a few people. You know, there's people that have done it. There's people that have thought about it. There was a session yesterday. There's only a few experts around the country, and so please take advantage of this session and pick the brains of these people, because it's kind of amazing right now that how little we know and how much they may know. So we have in the room, Charles D. Pascali. He's a senior associate for the National Center for the Improvement of Educational Assessment. We have Jessica Delforge, who is not at Fayette County Public Schools. She is the Rhode Island Department of Education. She's an education specialist. And Laura Jackson, District Service Program Associate at WestEd, but more importantly, formerly at the Rhode Island Department of Education as well. So a lot of practical experience and about how to do SLOs and what we know and what we don't know. So what I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of framework. Does this work?
It does.
And specifically take this as just a lot of my opinion. Now, I do some work in SLOs. I work with people around the country thinking about this, but I've never had to practice it like these people have, so they're going to know a lot more. But the first thing to think about when you're thinking about student learning objectives, and we all know student learning objectives are starting to be used for all sorts of accountability things, is that there is no definition of a student learning objective at the moment. There's no necessarily standard best practice. And to the extent that there are best practices, they're very locally dependent, depending on what state or locality you're in. But one way to think about it is that a student learning objective policy is actually a process. And the process can largely be described by this very unhelpful chart, which I love this chart, but the problem is it's unhelpful because it's so general. But if we think about in general terms, there are, say, 4 steps. By the way, this is not my slide. I ripped it off from a colleague, and I kind of like the way to describe it. But we can prepare an SLO. I'm not going to define that. We can review and approve an SLO. And then if it's not approved, we can go back to preparation and then go through this circle for a long time. And then we can collect evidence once it's been approved at the end of the year or at the end of a week, at the end of a semester. That's undefined as well. And then we can go to review and scoring. Scoring here is important for accountability purposes. It may not be important for the other reasons one might do an SLO. So I'm going to do one activity. I don't generally like activities, but everyone stand up. I apologize. I know people don't like to stand up in the morning. Yeah.
Okay. Everyone. All right.
Everyone turn and face north.
There's an Where's the sun?
Okay. So everyone's facing north. North is everywhere. Okay, I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to tell you that north is between that corner, I'm pointing over here, and that corner.
Yay. Oh.
So now where's north? So I mean, and going this way. Like. Okay. So north is somewhere over there. Yeah. Now, north is there. That's north. Now where's east? So everyone knows where east is, right? Once we know where north is. And so, okay, everyone sit down. Okay. Yeah, you can get up. You know, it's kind of chilly in here. Okay, dumb example, but really, you know, I like to talk about the SLO process as a, you know, we can start with assessment selection, and by assessment I mean trying to figure out where we are. Where's north? And by assessment selection, I don't mean pick a standardized assessment or anything like this. I mean real theoretical assessment. Can we figure out where our kids are? And then we can go to target setting, but we can't know where east is. We can't set east unless we know where north is. So we can't know where we're going unless we know where we are. You know, there's a scoring process, again, I mentioned that's for accountability. And there are areas for standardization all up and down the scale. And if you're at a state, you're probably going to, and I'm not going to speak for these folks, you're probably going to think about standardization right away because you have such problems with controlling all of your districts. If you're at a district, you're going to think about this, but it's going to be more important to think about the value of these types of things. And I'm not saying that these there's a good way to do this or a bad way to do this, but keep in mind that standardization changes this discussion. So, unfortunately, unlike East and North, there's a famous economist slash psychologist, Daniel Kahneman. He's got a great book. If you, the literature's tough, but if you're interested, we are prone to overestimate how much we understand about the world and underestimate the role of chance in events. This is well known. This is decades of research to know that people have a really hard time, even when they know a lot about a subject, they have a hard time figuring out what's going to happen in the future. And they have an even harder time understanding when they have input into that future, what's going to happen. So I just want to keep that in mind, because we need to do SLOs, but they're difficult. And everyone understands they're difficult, but at some level they're even more difficult than we think. And as far as a framework today, we have experts in the room that are going to talk a heck of a lot about the SLO process. And I'm going to claim there are two dimensions that you have to think about. There are many more probably, but two main ones. The process, and the process has all sorts of potential benefits and all sorts of things about it, which I don't know anything about, and I'll let others talk about it. But there's also measurement. And by measurement, I mean assessment. And that's why if we don't know where north is, how do we know where east is? And so I just want to go through a quick thought experiment just to get us in the right frame of mind. Is a statistical growth measure, SGP, value added, any of these things, is that an SLO? Anyone have an opinion? No, why not? Look at the data, set a target for students. We say, no, it's not an SLO. Well, what is value added? At the beginning of the year, we look at a data point, student achievement score. We statistically determine what a goal is for that kid using a model. And then we determine whether or not you met that goal, whether or not you beat that prediction or did not beat that prediction, and then aggregate that across a bunch of students. Is this an SLO? No. Mathematically,
I mean, I think you could argue that it's a state calculated SLO for a teacher.
you could, yeah.
I know this, maybe it's going here, but would SGP then be not an SLO because you're not necessarily sure, so all exams in one?
So,
I'm just asking.
so one person says, yeah, you could say, well, that's a state SLO, and Bart says, well, but it's backwards looking, right? And so, philosophically, I think that we could argue about this. Philosophically, no, it's not an SLO. There's a couple reasons for that. One, it's backwards looking. I think that's a primary issue. And there's another one, which is it's not owned by the teacher. But although that doesn't necessarily, SLOs don't have to be owned by the teacher. In practice, across the country, they most certainly are. All over the country, we say student growth percentiles and value-added measures, and any time that there's a standardized test, we see people throw that into the SLO category. And I don't have an opinion on that. It is a little bit odd. I think that's my opinion. It's a value-added model. It's a student growth model. Mathematically, you can show, and if we want to sit in a room for a couple hours, these are equivalent. You can show an equivalence between the two. But one is retrospectively looking and one is forward-looking. So the reason I say that is because any of the problems, any of the issues that you've heard about with value-added or student growth models, a lot of those problems have to do with problems with the assessment. So a low quality of assessment, an inappropriate use of an assessment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I would claim that a lot of issues that can arise in the SLO implementation, and not all of them, but some of them that can arise, are exactly the same as in value-added measures and student growth measures. So keep that in mind. I'm going to predict that there's going to be a firestorm about SLOs in the future. It's already starting. I was at AERA the other day, or the week, and I gave a little talk on SLOs, and a principal stood up and said, "You are killing us." I said, "Okay, I didn't think I was killing you," but so it's going to start. It's going to be just like value-added growth models, unless you get out ahead of it and start talking about it and start thinking about it a lot like these folks have done. So yeah, again, all the test measures that are interesting. So I'll just conclude and I'll say predicting the future is hard. We know it's hard, even when you know a lot about the situation. Statistical models all statistical models are using a bunch of data to help us predict things. That's all they ever are. So they can help us with that. And if they fail, it's not like humans are going to do much better. So then we have to think about the process. And that's what we're going to talk about. Because if you have a good process and good communication, I think, and I hope these guys think, you can overcome some of these issues. But you still have to recognize that they're there. Do you want?
Yes. Thank you. So I'm just going to switch over. As Andrew said, my name's Laura Jackson, and I'm currently working for WestEd, but I've been over the last 3 years working at the Department of Ed in Rhode Island very closely with both Charlie and Jessica on student learning objectives in Rhode Island, and we're in our third year. Well, it kind of depends when you start counting. We did gradual implementation and now full implementation. So I don't think we feel like we got out in front on things because we were doing it very fast paced, but we've had a lot of learning along the way, and that's what we want to share with you. Okay, and just sort of a warning or a heads up, we are going to ask you to kind of participate this morning. It's tough sometimes early in the morning, but we've learned from doing a lot of training on SLOs that it's much more effective if you're actually actively engaged. So that's what we're going to hopefully be able to do for you today. So we wanted to begin by just explaining what our goals for this time are. First, we want to explain or have you understand how the purpose of SLOs, the ways in which we were using SLOs in Rhode Island, influenced our model design. We want to explore some of the challenges and the opportunities that arose through our implementation over the last few years. And finally, have you consider how our lessons learned can inform implementation in other districts and states around the country. So we want to begin by sort of acknowledging that you all are coming from a variety of backgrounds, and we know from the registration information that some of you are sort of in this practitioner camp and some of you are more in a researcher role. So I wanted to just do a quick show of hands so that we could see. Raise your hand if you are here because you will be using or you currently are using SLOs in your district or state. Oh, okay, so we have a lot of practitioners here. Good. And how about if you are studying the use of SLOs or supporting the use of SLOs more from a researcher perspective? Okay, thank you. And so you may not feel like you are squarely in one camp or the other. Is there anybody who feels like they really don't fit in either of those camps, have a role that's not captured? Okay, so we tried to reflect that in our materials so that the things that we're asking you to think about would kind of feel meaningful for both practitioners and researchers, because we've tried to wear both those hats. Jessica and I are sort of more in the practitioner camp, and I think Andrew and Charlie are slightly more in the researcher camp, although Charlie's done a lot of on-the-ground work with us. Maybe he started thinking he was coming into research and didn't always work out that way. Okay, so I know that when some people were coming in, they were looking at some of the materials and thinking like, oh, do I have SLO beliefs? I don't know, that's kind of a lofty statement. We think you might. If you don't have materials, there are place settings up in the front, but we can bring some around. Maybe you could, yeah. So there's a blue piece of paper. And we want you to locate that and use it to kind of unearth some of the, what we're calling SLO baggage that you might be coming in with, because we think that no matter where you're coming from geographically or how much work you've done in this area, you likely have some assumptions or beliefs about what SLOs are, how they should be used, or perhaps strong beliefs about how they should not be used. So we want to, rather than sidestepping that, we want to just dig right into it. So we're asking you to locate that blue paper and go through just over a few minutes, read those statements, and rate the degree to which you agree or disagree with them. And then once you've had a chance to do that, find somebody at your table that you can kind of compare with and see how each of you responded, and take a few minutes to maybe dig into one or two and explain your rationale for that. All right, so we're going to ask you to come back together. It's probably something you could talk about for much longer. We know that. Maybe it'll give some fodder for conversations after the session. Thank you. So we feel a little cut off being behind a podium, behind a table as former classroom teachers. It's not really our comfort zone. And we really wanted to hear what you were talking about. So we're wondering if anybody wants to share out one in particular that they either felt strongly about or got into a conversation about. There is no right answer. If the field hasn't come up with a definition of SLOs, they certainly haven't agreed to right answers about these questions. So anything that you talked about that you would be willing to share?
With number 2, the purpose of SLOs is to measure teacher effectiveness in non-test grading subjects. I might have disagreed with the way the item was written. I strongly agree.
So we know which camp you're in.
Andy, is there something you can do to control it?
A couple of caveats. First off, it's also for tested subjects as well. That's something that I would say. And that it would be also part of the system, you know, by itself. It's not enough.
Thank you. Yes.
We had an interesting discussion on the first question, which was teachers should write their own SLOs, and we're all state level. If we all agree that teachers shouldn't write them in isolation, or we think they should be involved in the conversation, so that's kind of
Thank you.
So we had the same conversation, but we went on to talk about the purpose or the use of the SLO can really drive that response. If you are seeing it solely as an accountability measure, then teacher involvement is much less important. But if you're seeing it as an improvement measure, then the teacher involvement has much more impact.
Thank you. It's almost as if we planted you all there. We're going to be talking about all of these things. So that's kind of validating, because I think we feel like in Rhode Island we have been doing this work largely alone. So it's always very nice to hear that people coming from different contexts are finding the same issues, wrestling with the same issues. And it's interesting with this first item, I think we meant teachers should be involved in writing, but now I see the way that it's written, it could also spark a conversation about whether they should write them entirely on their own. So we will talk about that today. So thanks for playing. So as you know, or probably discovered in your conversation, the term SLO does not mean the same thing to everyone. And they're being used in different ways in different places around the country. So what we wanted to talk about was how within that landscape, there are a variety of models that may fit your context, and what we're talking about is our model in Rhode Island, which we feel like is not necessarily the best model, but it was the best model for our purpose. The model that you design is influenced by a variety of factors, including the size of the state or the district. So obviously in Rhode Island we have kind of a unique situation being in a state, but also a state where we could have all our assistant superintendents in a room together every month quite easily, or physically drive to any district in the state if they needed something. So that's one factor. Also, there are sometimes legislation or regulations to consider about how educator evaluation is mandated in the state. The available or mandated assessments could certainly influence your model design, as well as, and perhaps most importantly, your intended purpose. So that kind of gets at the comment that you made just a moment ago. And that's certainly something that we want to talk about today. So we will dig into our model a little bit, but before we do that, we kind of wanted to frame it with a metaphor. So these pictures are the best I could do with clip art that I didn't have to pay for. But what I wanted to do is kind of present this idea of cooking versus baking. So raise your hand if you like to cook. Hands down. Raise your hand if you like to bake. Okay. Raise your hand if you like to do both. Okay, thank you. The reason why I ask is because I'm squarely someone who likes to cook, and I don't enjoy baking, and I'll tell you why. When I cook, I can kind of be creative, I can kind of fudge it a little. You know, if you think about something like a stir fry or a chili, there's some basic ingredients, but then if I have peppers in the fridge, I'll throw in peppers. It's not in the recipe, but it'll still taste good. Or I cook for a little while and I taste it and it needs salt, so I just kind of eyeball it and throw some in. My husband is an engineer, and this makes him crazy because he says, "Why are you doing this? There's a recipe. Someone already figured out the best way to do this. Why are you being creative?" But that's what I enjoy. Baking is much more prescriptive. You know, there are set measurements that you have to abide by. You have to do things in a certain order. That doesn't appeal to me. So there are people who, you know, who really gravitate to one or the other. Some of you can wear both hats. Well, our model in Rhode Island for writing SLOs and using SLOs is a little bit more like cooking at this point. And by that we mean there are some basic ingredients that everyone sort of agreed this is part of the recipe, but it does require a little bit of tasting and adjusting as you go. We don't feel like there is a strict recipe you can follow. And we think that perhaps over time, things will become a little bit tighter and a little bit more standardized, but our model really intends to be very close to the classroom level and sort of responsive to the context. So we think we'll never get to a place where it really is a strict recipe that you can follow. And from the state level, we wanted something that did allow for some district level flexibility. Additionally, you know, we recognize that this type of model can feel very freeing to some people, maybe people who are more like me who think, oh, thank God, I can be involved. It's not mandated to me exactly how to do this. I can kind of use my own professional judgment and the tools that I have available to me. And other people feel very uncomfortable with this, and they say, I don't quite know how to do this. Please just tell me what to do. So you might be feeling one way or the other, and certainly the administrators and teachers in the districts and states that you work in probably feel this way. There's a mix of people who think that SLOs have a lot of opportunity, and it's quite refreshing that it's, you know, teacher-driven and quite local, and others who feel very uncomfortable with this. And we just kind of have to live with that at the moment, or that's what we found in Rhode Island. So we want to frame one of the key kind of decisions that we had to make was about, well, what is the purpose of SLOs in Rhode Island? And we knew that we needed a tool for measuring student learning as part of the educator evaluation system, but we didn't want this to be something that was just about educator evaluation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later and just how time-consuming this is and what it requires of people. So we knew that we wanted it to feel meaningful and have value for the teachers or for the educators who were involved in this process. And we wanted it to reflect what we think is the work of good teachers, which is involving goal setting and progress monitoring. So we attempted to design a model that would do both. That could be an accountability tool, but also an instructional tool, which is easier said than done. So this dual purpose and kind of philosophy about SLOs and how they should be used influenced our design. And we aren't going to go through all the details of the Rhode Island model, but we wanted to call out a few features that we think kind of represent our SLO values or beliefs. So one thing to know is that all teachers in Rhode Island, whether they are in tested or non-tested grades and subjects, set between 2 and 4 SLOs as part of the model. And in our guidance, we really do encourage sort of a bottom-up approach where teachers are closely involved throughout this process, and we do always try to refer to it as a process. You know, the SLO is not this piece of paper. It is this process that happens throughout the year. In Rhode Island, SLOs can be measured using a variety of evidence sources, so we say it should be the highest quality evidence source available, but that could be a commercial or standardized assessment. It could also be a locally developed assessment. We also encourage the use of tiered targets, so the targets should be reflective of the students in that classroom, and oftentimes that means having tiers for students who are coming in with a variety of backgrounds. We encourage progress monitoring throughout the process, so there's an embedded mid-year checkpoint where teachers can revise their SLOs in agreement with their evaluator, as well as professional judgment in scoring at the end of the process. So as we rolled this out and started implementing SLOs in Rhode Island, we realized that having this model that attempted to be both an accountability tool and an instructional tool required educators to balance some competing needs, which is also not easy to do. So one, as I've mentioned, is the balance between accountability and improvement or instruction. Another is this balance between consistency and personalization. So we're rolling out a statewide model. It's intended to be used by all educators in the state, and we do want a certain degree of consistency, but we also want it to be something that feels meaningful for teachers and reflects their context and the students that they're working with. Finally, we feel this tension between rigor and attainability, and knowing that ultimately the sweet spot is in the middle, but that's hard to find. And the scales in each of these tensions kind of tips one way or the other depending on policy and the way things are rolled out. So we think that when you have to err, and particularly in the beginning, we know that we will, we encourage in Rhode Island folks to think about erring on the side of improvement and instruction as opposed to accountability, erring on the side of personalization as opposed to consistency, knowing both are important, but if you have to kind of make that choice, and erring on the side of rigor over attainability. And for each of those kind of tensions, we feel like you can, or we answered that question by thinking about, well, what's going to be better for kids? So particularly in the example of rigor versus attainability, we want teachers to set rigorous goals for students because we think that if you set a goal that feels attainable but might not be rigorous, that's ultimately probably not going to serve your students as well as it could. So that's kind of just a touch point that we kept in mind to keep going back to, is what's going to be better for our students.
And I guess I'll just say here, much easier said than done, I think, to all of those points. And I think that we acknowledge that and recognize that
yes.
fully.
So no one in the state of Rhode Island, including us, would tell us that we've found that balance. It's something that we continue to wrestle with. But there are people in Rhode Island who we think feel that they are getting closer and can start to see some of the value in this process. So what we want to share with you is a short video that we made last year featuring some Rhode Island educators talking about the benefits of the SLO process that we think kind of illustrates what can happen when you start to find that balance, when you get that balance right. I'm going to pull that up for us now.
An SLO is nothing more than a roadmap. I think that there are, obviously we have a destination, but there are pits and stops along the way that you pull that map out and use it again to reflect, to redirect where necessary so that you can get to that destination. It's where you stop and ask for directions from other people.
This process, even though we call it SLOs, it's not new, it's something that good teachers do.
An SLO is essentially your essential goals or your essential questions that we all develop in our classes anyway. And so this is just a way of documenting that.
A lot of us felt like it honored what we had been doing already. And someone said the joke about SLOs and with the educator evaluation, like, welcome to the we've been waiting for you. It really did send us the message that what we were doing was right, that it was valued. And just setting the message and communicating it regularly that we value local teachers making local decisions about local data. Teachers respond to that because they're smart people. They know how to support students.
I don't want to imply that this is brand new. It's just that we've never had the language to discuss it before, because now we're given this terminology, this vocabulary, this structure that we can use to talk about the good work that this teacher is doing.
First, I freaked out, I think, thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to choose these learning objectives? And with all of the students that you teach and all of the things they need to learn, how are you going to choose which ones?
Well, I think the initial knee-jerk perception is that it's an add-on. Oh, one more thing so they can tell me I'm not good, And so I think it takes a lot of skill on the part of every evaluator to really change the nature of that conversation, because it isn't an add-on. It's really about getting to the heart of teaching.
Last year, when I was first introduced to the new evaluation system and I learned about SLOs, I thought, this is a waste of my time. And I don't have time to waste.
Yeah, I mean, at first I had this delusion of grandeur, that everyone would have for their second SLO math or literacy based. And I just thought, we all teach reading and writing, and all of us have math in our content area somehow. And then I realized that when I was requesting that from certain areas, it would kind of be like shoving a square peg in a round hole. You could do it, but I didn't want to force teachers to do something that wasn't a natural fit to what they do. A lot of people that were creating new assessments for their SLO, and it kind of became this separate entity from what they do day to day. And that's not good for the kids or for the teacher. You don't want it to be like SLO day. You want it to just be part of what you do.
In the buildings where I see this process going smoothly, I think the teachers have come together to form teams, grade level teams, and they've had the ownership to create the assessments. And they come together on a regular basis to talk about the data, talk about the lessons they've created around the work, and there's a sense of collaboration around this work.
So it just came down to really listening to the teacher and them saying, like, it is not a good fit for me, looking at the curriculum and realizing, yeah, it's not, and I don't want to force you to do something that just for this process if it's not what's important to what you teach.
I think the most positive thing I've seen administrators do is when they can calmly present this whole idea of this evaluation system in a positive light.
We look at this as getting better at what we do, supporting kids, and improving their reading, their writing, their mathematics, and their skills in all the content areas.
Yeah, in general, I think one of the biggest benefits from the SLO process has been the level of collaboration that's resulted from it. Even if it's a brief conversation in the hallway, or it's at common planning time, or if I organize a meeting, the amount of time that we spend actually discussing student progress, I think, has skyrocketed, and it always comes back to those SLOs and that data.
The thing that I like best about the SLO process is that it puts the student in the evaluation process.
It was like a light bulb that came on. Like, why are we leaving students out of this process? Like, they're the number one stakeholder here, and so why don't we pull them in and show them the data?
If students can see how well they're doing, and if they can set goals to improve, and if they get regular feedback on how they're doing towards those ends, they're more motivated to do the work.
I think it forces you to do that progress monitoring, and so you don't have students who are slipping through the cracks, so to speak, and you're really targeting, well, they're not going to meet this SLO, so what do I need to do as an educator to get them to meet that? And so we're not just passing them on to the next grade, they are actually becoming proficient in the targets and the essential questions that you set.
Just let me teach. I hear that a lot, and I agree with it. But there's an addition to that. Just let me teach what my students need. How do you know what your students need if you're not analyzing the results? You're shooting in the dark. And what we know when you shoot in the dark, you almost always miss.
It's like a doctor, prescribing blood pressure medicine to someone and never monitoring their blood pressure, never taking readings. So how do you know how much medicine they should take, or if they need to even take it anymore?
So when I look at my data as the year goes on, I can see the students that I really need to focus on more. And that allows me the chance to meet with them periodically throughout the year before it's too late, and to really try to get them to where we think they should be.
School leaders need to help find the time for teachers to do that through faculty meeting time, through any common playing time that's been identified, through release time, through focused, sustained professional learning communities.
We know you didn't become a teacher for paperwork. You became a teacher to help students grow, and this is one tool that you're going to use to get there. We're delivering it with a smile because we're here for kids, and how can you not get excited about that?
I try to always focus on the student, and always think about our overall goal is to help students.
I think SLOs help you to see whether you're being effective or not, and that's what the evaluation process is. Are you an effective teacher? And if students aren't learning, you're not effective.
There's a lot of jargon and surface talk about what makes a teacher important. But for me, the SLO is where the rubber meets the road, that we are able, that we have skills to design the right learning activity to help determine where a child is according to a set of criteria. And for me, that's our skill. And so it's really worthy that we perfect that. It has been very challenging, and so I just really want to encourage us as a profession to give this a chance, to really take it seriously.
It makes me feel successful, and it makes me feel like they will be successful in their next grade level. I know that I've helped them to grow and develop so that they're ready to move on.
So before setting student learning objectives, I would wonder if students were learning. And through setting these student learning objectives, now I have my evidence and I know that students are learning. And that to me is one of the most beautiful things, to see with your own eyes that students are learning while looking at the data that you are getting from your SLOs.
Now that I've gone through it for a couple of years, I see the benefits of it, and I see how it really can help drive my instruction, and it really makes me more knowledgeable about my students as the year goes on, which makes me a better teacher. It makes me more able to meet their needs, which that's my job when it all comes down to it.
Is everyone feeling inspired? That's what we wanted. So I did see some head nodding. I think that they made some points that resonate with people. Obviously, this isn't representative of everyone's experience. We were going to people that had told us we've found value in this. So that, just to be, transparent.
I think, can I just say something about that, which is that we have a lot of venues and forums to get feedback from educators across the state, where we can then push out what people are telling us, and often what they're telling us is, this is not working for me. So there are a lot of areas where we were already acknowledging that, and this to us felt like, what a great opportunity to share a different side and a voice that is sometimes not always fully heard, which is, hey, we've actually found some ways to make this process start working for us, so that others could hear that and start realizing that there were little tweaks they could start to make along the way to help them move forward.
Great. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Jessica at this point, and the color scheme isn't working for us right now, but what we're going to talk about is sort of the implementation gap. So this gap between the intent of the model and what it sort of is like on the ground.
Great, thank you. And so sometimes, right, when we talk about with like rosy glasses, how this is the model and it has this dual purpose, and isn't this so wonderful? Teachers are coming together, they're working with administration. You heard Chris Haskins, one of the principals in here, talking about you get all this time to collaborate together, but then you realize that that actually doesn't happen a lot. And so trying to help people make the jump, it looks small in this image from the design to the implementation, but what we realized along the way is sometimes those are like mile-long chasms in between the intent and then the reality. And so one of our biggest jobs over the last few years has been trying to help people make that leap and figure out what ladder, what rope, what tool do you need in order to get from point A to point B. And that is much harder said than done. And so there are a lot of things that crop up that make that gap wider. And sometimes there were things that we thought maybe we could anticipate, and others we had no idea. So sometimes it's just the structures that are going on in a district. So there's maybe some issues with collective bargaining unit, and you actually cannot have teachers coming in before or after school to do work together. Sometimes it's the fact that there was no comprehensive assessment system in a district, and so teachers were saying, we don't even have assessments that we can use for this process. Sometimes it's saying we don't have a data system at all where we can actually share data. This teacher has some data, I have this other data. There's no way for us to be able to share and look at it together. So there are a ton of issues that can crop up here. And we really started to see in that first year that the SLO process was becoming a flashlight and shining all the light on all these other issues that didn't matter if we were doing SLOs or not. Those were still problems, right? It's not okay that your teachers can't come together and collaborate. It's not okay that your principal or who is supposed to be your instructional leader doesn't really even know what you teach or your content, which we were hearing from a lot of people. To be able to support you in that process, that you don't have data to look at, that you don't feel like you have assessments or tools. So it really became, people I think started to get frustrated at SLOs. And when we really started talking about it, it really actually seemed like they were angry for very good reasons for all these other issues. So then how do you actually move SLOs forward when you have all of these other things starting to crop up? And so Charlie, do you want to jump in a little bit too and talk about how when you're trying to get from the design to the implementation, the balances that we were talking about before, those scales, can start to really tip a lot because those forces can drive that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it goes back to when we're talking about, you know, accountability tool versus an instructional tool, and how that's all communicated. And part of the challenge is if you're coming at it from primarily the accountability perspective and primarily the external accountability perspective, that you're going to start to lean more heavily on the one side, and you're going to start to freak out about all of the measurement kind of issues and standardization issues that Andrew kind of raised earlier. In Rhode Island, we, as I think Laura said at the beginning, we've been working with Rhode Island for about a dozen years, 10, 11 years, somewhere in there now, on an SLO, only the last few, but we've been working on implementing the state has a new set of regulations in 2003 which focused on proficiency and personalization, both of those things together, and it started with the high school level on proficiency-based graduation requirements. So we've been working with schools for about the last 10 years, high schools and then down to middle school, on bringing the accountability more into the classroom, into the schools. They had to basically be able to designate whether or not or classify kids as proficient in 6 different subject areas for graduation. And there were state tests in a couple of areas, and those could play a part, but we've been working for the last dozen years on trying to increase the school's ability to define proficiency and measure proficiency for kids. And so we had that going for at least the middle school and high school, and this was just a natural extension of that kind of work, and several people you saw in the video have been working on that for a while. So it was already had that for those schools. They already had the culture of getting together, collaborating, talking about assessments, talking about data, talking about what proficient means, what it looks like, what are the criteria. We had the 7 or 8 criteria for a good assessment program in the school, so they were already building on that. Other places which hadn't bought into that or really hadn't focused on that were coming at it much more from the accountability challenge perspective and looking at it as an add-on, and so it's a much wider gap for some of those places.
Yeah. And I think just trying to think too about things that we hadn't necessarily anticipated. So we knew that there might be some places where assessment literacy or just assessment work needed some support. I don't think that we hadn't thought about that. There were definitely moments though, meeting with teachers, and because we are so small, we can within an hour get to just about anywhere, which I know is crazy for some of you in other larger states. And so we would get
But point out that we do still have to have regional meetings. And
I know.
They're all in the same hotel, but they need to be regional meetings.
Yep. As a non-Rhode Island native, to me, it is still crazy. But so thinking there were moments where we'd be meeting with teachers, and I would say, okay, well, like the first question you ask is, what's the most essential content or skills that you really need your students to have by the time they walk out your door on the last day of school? And there would be teachers who would look at me and be like, I have no idea. That was something we had not fully anticipated, that there would be teachers who could not answer that question for themselves. And sometimes they'd be like, well, let's start with your curriculum. And they'd say, we don't actually have an arts curriculum in my district. And they would come with a different district's curriculum and be like, should we start with this? And I think those were these moments where it was like, oh, the gap is so much wider than we had anticipated, and realizing that there was so much extra work that needed to go in there. And really, for us, started asking ourselves, what's the role of the state versus the role of local districts? When does that line blur appropriately, and when do we have to back off a little bit? Or when do you put your hand in the cookie jar a little more than you think might be sort of your role? And I think that we've really played a lot with that. And I know that it's different for every state or for every district if you're thinking about all the schools in your district. But that's something that you'll probably hear as a theme throughout the rest of this. So trying to get people from A to B and to jump with us came up. There were a number of challenges. We've only chosen 3. There were probably 7,000. And you can, I think, hear in the video too, people talking about how they were successful at dealing with some of these, and there were some hints. So the first challenge we really felt was firming up the foundation. So it's really difficult to participate in an SLO process if you don't have a good sense as a teacher of your curriculum and your standards, if you don't feel like you have some quality assessments or assessment literacy, and if you don't feel comfortable using data to drive decisions and monitor instruction and do all of that work. Again, it's really difficult if you have administrators who don't feel comfortable helping their teachers through that and they don't have some of those skills, or if they don't feel comfortable facilitating the learning of their teachers. Sometimes they've been building managers, very good at that, but not necessarily instructional leaders. And that was a big gap we hadn't fully participated or expected to help people with. And we really almost see it as a house, and you need this foundation of these skills to be able to do this well. The second was a professional development burden. We went in with a theory of action, which was even though we're small, there is no way we can meet and talk with every teacher in the state. We were a team of 5, but we were rarely ever a full team of 5. And so it was almost impossible. So we said, well, we're going to make sure that we touch every single administrator in the state. We're going to train and meet and work with them very intensely. Their role then is to bring this back to their teachers and support them. And this became a telephone game in which teachers would call the Department of Education frequently, telling us what we thought were like lies about SLOs, that SLOs had to be a standardized assessment, that they had no choice in the matter, that we were forcing all of these things down onto them, just things that were the opposite of our entire purpose in the model, we thought. But that's not what people heard, and so it was interesting to hear about getting in front of your message. I wish that this video had existed at the beginning of our time, and in reality, we couldn't have ever done that. We would have had to take a bunch of you and give you a script and tell you, could you just say this for us? And so the PD burden became much more intense than we had planned or thought. And then the last one, comparability and quality. So if we're trying, some districts really took this as, if it's going to be equal and fair, then it needs to be the same for everybody. And I think our argument that I've stolen from Laura, which is always, we want everyone to have a pair of shoes, but just because we all want them to have a pair of shoes, that doesn't mean you give everyone the same size shoe, because that's not actually helping everyone. Give everyone a shoe that fits them. And so it's going to have to look a little different for some people, based on your content, based on your grade level, sometimes just based on your context. And so trying to get some comparability and quality has been a really difficult piece for us. So what we'd like to do, because we know we've been talking for a little while now, is to actually dig into some of these challenges and think about, for you all, in your different contexts, how these might arise also. So you have a page, you don't actually have a packet, you just have 2 pieces of paper. You've already seen the blue one. You find the other Easterish colored paper, and it's called Implementation Challenge. And you all have different ones based on the color that you have. There's a quick summary of one of these 3 big challenges. We'd like you to read through it, and then on the back there's a little quick write to do independently. Then when you're done with that, you're going to find somebody else with the same color, maybe this is a good opportunity to find somebody at a different table, to meet someone new, and to discuss the challenge. And once you're finished sort of talking through it, draft a question together about this that you can not only ask us, but really ask the entire group. Because, you know, while we have been doing this for a couple of years, in no way are we actual experts in this, because I just don't think that fully exists. We have a lot of ideas because we think about this a lot, but all of you have a lot of ideas too that we want to be able to bring up in the room. So probably take about 2 minutes to read, maybe a minute to do the quick write, and then a few minutes to discuss with a partner, and then draft a question together. So what we'd like to do now is to just quickly talk about these 3 challenges, and also to hear your voices throughout this process as we open it up towards the end to have a full group discussion. And one thing that Charlie had said to me as we were going around and listening to everybody was the importance of emphasizing that we did not put our resources out there and start this process and then expect that, oh, we did it for a year. Everybody good now? That this is taking years. This is a very long process if you think about realizing all these other gaps that might be existing currently, to shore those things up and to be able to help people not only just understand this process better and to do this process better, but all the other issues that come along with it. This is a multi-year, slow, long game, and sometimes I think it's easy to get caught up in the short game and to feel like, oh, it's not working. But when we take a step back and think about where Rhode Island was a few years ago, it's actually amazing to think, I think, about the progress that a state, nevertheless, each individual district and teachers and administrators have come. And so we just sort of keep that in the back of our minds when we're not feeling so good about it. So the first challenge was firming up the foundation. Here are a few things that we learned in our experience, but it could be different for you in your own context. It definitely relies on sound knowledge of standards and curriculum, assessment, and data use. I love the fact that it's based on those things because I would hope that it should be based on these things because that's really about teaching and learning. But that's not always, that foundation is not always firm in different districts. Teachers need time to do this work. If you're actually going to collaborate and not do it, close the door and do it on the island of your own classroom, then there have to be policies and practices and procedures in place to actually do this together. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Maybe the only music teacher
yes.
or the only Latin teacher in the county.
Yep.
So how do you facilitate collaboration with those teachers?
That's great. So I'm a former arts and literacy administrator and teacher, but also I was a former arts teacher and administrator. And so I sort of became the arts person to go to on our team because I had a lot of music teachers saying I'm the one elementary music teacher here. Who am I supposed to talk to? So we really started to try to get districts to say, pull your district arts teachers together. You might not be the same grade level, but you can definitely talk the same language and work with one another and support each other. We had so many arts teachers saying, why am I at this full day long district PD about the state test when I could be just working with all of the arts teachers having this really great conversation? So we've been trying to get that, and sometimes at our charter schools that can also sometimes feel like little islands, to say, you're in the same town. Just meet 5 minutes down the street from one another. You want to come to ride? You can do it with us. Trying to create opportunities for that, because I think that there are a lot of resources around in our districts that we just don't capitalize on, which is mainly the people. And so that is, I feel like I say it over and over again, easier said than done. But it's really about getting, I think, central office leadership on board to try and make that a priority.
And if I could just add to that, again, geographically it's easier in Rhode Island, but we also had help from some sort of professional organizations, so particularly in the arts, the name's escaping me, but
RISCA, the Rhode Island State Council
for the Arts, did some of that convening so that arts teachers from many districts could come together and do some work collaboratively.
Yeah. And that's a great thing to highlight because they even had a couple thousand, literally $2,000 that they hadn't used in their budget that year that they said, what if we create a grant and we get 3 different districts to come together and we'll just pay for subs for you all and we're going to make it work. So trying to find some external partners to collaborate in that process is great. There are other states that we've talked to and they've said, we have all these partners that help us in this work. We're really close with the unions, and they're really on board. And we sat there like, really?
What's that like?
That's great. I wonder what it would be like, because that's not fully the case for us. But to think about who do you have that could be a partner to support some of that work, especially if people are islands. We've talked a little bit already about how principals needed to be instructional leaders. And so a few things that we did, we tried to create a sort of assessment toolkit for teachers and for districts, a set of resources that if they felt like, how do I know if my assessment is of high quality? Here's a tool that you can use collaboratively. Or how do I go about starting to craft my own assessment if I feel like there isn't one that I can just select? We also felt like the telephone game was becoming so problematic that we created online modules so that it was our voices behind the microphone saying, I'm going to tell you what the purpose and what the actual model is supposed to be like for SLOs. I'm going to explain to you what I think the process should be if you were to try and identify what an objective statement is for you, so that it wasn't somebody else saying what they had heard from somebody else, but that teachers, it was more transparent to everybody. And lastly, trying to create a process for some local standard setting. And so again, like we sometimes felt like we created all these resources and that people just weren't using them. And so you look at like the analytics on our website, and sometimes it'd be like, come on, like guys, we just created this resource just for this purpose. But if you don't have the time to use it as a teacher, are you really going to be going online to the Department of Ed's website and pulling up this thing for you to do in isolation? Of course not. So I think you have to get districts and school leaders on board to actually push this out and use it with teachers. Our second one was this PD burden. So we felt like it had to be about instructional improvement because it takes so much time. Teachers had to be involved in it. We had some districts that said, well, we want it to be comparable, and so we're just going to tell you what your SLO should be about. Or you can pick your own objective statement, but I'm going to tell you the assessment you have to use. So sometimes there's a disconnect there. Or to say, well, an appropriate target is always 80% of my students will do this, 20% of my students will do this. Well, if that's not really the way your class composition looks, like why would you always go 80-20? So these weird little things started cropping up, and then all of a sudden teachers felt like they weren't involved, and this wasn't actually connected to their instructional practice, and it felt like an add-on. And you also can't train educators to make a cultural shift. So sometimes there are teachers who say to us that they should not be evaluated based on evidence of student learning. It's hard to push out an SLO process if teachers aren't on board for that, or if principals say, no, my job is to be the building manager here. This is not my job to be able to do this. And so trying to really shift that takes a very long time, and I actually don't think that we were as fully prepared to do that as we should have been. But we tried to reach out and start involving teachers and working directly with them. We tried to switch from this face-to-face train the trainer to this blended approach of let's use some online modules. And then we tried to move from out-of-district PD, where we said, okay, we're going to host this thing, everybody sign up, meet us in the middle of the state, or regionally, to actually say this year, we said, we're going to push into all districts. So sign up for some sessions around SLO topics that you think your district would benefit from. We'll come to you. That was a major time issue for us. Our team basically became constant trainers all year, and that meant we had to let go of other things off of our plate, but we felt like it was the right thing to do for people. And the last one is this comparability and quality. So we really learned that LEA policymakers need to understand the purpose of it. We think that we made the mistake in the first year of just trying to explain to people, well, what is an SLO? If you know that, you'll be okay. But we didn't really explain the whole purpose of why we were doing it, and that was such a mistake. Because then people didn't want to buy into this thing that just seemed like it was different from what they were doing all the time.
Or they made policies that kind of didn't work.
Absolutely. And then to think about setting both some of those short-term and those long-term priorities. So our short-term priorities are that people are aligned in their districts. We're not as worried right now about making sure that across the entire state, all the SLOs are equally rigorous. I would much rather start to make sure pocket by pocket, district by district, that they're aligned, rather than try and do the whole state at once, because you're just not going to get there. So we said that we were okay in the first couple of years of just trying to make sure that districts were set, and that we're going to start to move to a place where we think that across districts they're more aligned. Some people are really uncomfortable with that. And so we tried to just clarify guidance as much as possible. We had a lot of myths going around, tried to make sure that we were coming back to facts. We tried to rebrand SLOs a little bit because they had become the SLOs, as in we're going to slow you down in your teaching. And so we tried to say it's not about slowing you down or getting in your way. We think that this is about what you do every day, and trying to really get that message out there. Otherwise, we would never have chosen it. And also to switch to calibration models where districts could start to do this work on their own and have more ownership over it, rather than having it be the state as a race to the top state pushing down and trying to get people to get on board, because Race to the Top for us is ending in September. So our whole team will basically dissolve. So how can we make sure that the districts can actually keep carrying this work on? So we're curious to hear from you, and maybe we'll just do a little quick ideas based on your own experience that you brought into today, maybe seeing the video, maybe having conversations with each other. Can we just hear about 3 benefits that you think, either for teachers, for students, for administrators, that might come up for engaging in this SLO process? Great, start us off.
I think one benefit is that it really gets teachers to engage in data. And looking specifically at, I don't just teach English, I teach these particular kids. So let me find out where they are and how I can use that particular kid as well as my class on the whole. And it's really challenged us to create more data sets for high school. We were lacking, I felt like it was there in high school. So
Yeah.
those teachers have gotten together and talked about creating some common assessments.
Great. Thank you. It's another benefit. Great.
For teachers, one of the things that I keep hearing is that it recognizes the work that they're already doing, or that they feel that a good teacher should do. So that, I think, is one benefit.
Great, thank you. Let's hear one more. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that has also become a challenge, right? So we've had a lot of teachers say, I'm going to do this SLO process with a curriculum that's brand new to me. How am I supposed to do this? So I think all of the things that you have brought up as benefits come with tags of challenges along the way. These are not just, oh, it's a pro or it's a con. They're all connected. And I think that even at the end of the day, you know, we only brought 3 challenges, and again, there could have been 7,000. With all those in existence, we still feel like the benefits are worth it. For us, at least as a state, even if SLOs drop off the face of the planet in the next couple of years, I still feel like the process has been a good one, and that you heard one principal on here say the conversations we're having now are more about students and more about looking at data together, getting to know our curriculum, making sure that high school perhaps has more access to data. So even if it all goes away, I still feel like this is the right basket to put our eggs in, rather than one that could have been a standardized approach for everybody that was more top-down. And I think that's just really where our heart lies. So these are some of the ones that we had come up with, which you already said. Focusing on all students, increasing those conversations, having collaboration, and really pushing instructional leadership across content areas. But there are a lot more. So we just really want to make sure that you all can ask some questions, either to us, but also really to one another in the room. Like we said before, while we might have been doing it for a few years, well, I don't think that we're experts in this. And so if Andrew, I think, is going to moderate for us, and so if you have questions, we're really excited to hear them.
So it's just a time check. We have about 10 minutes, and we have to leave about 2 minutes to do some survey stuff. So a few questions, and maybe I'll use a bully pulpit to ask one that's sort of burning for me. It's much more operational, but there are a lot of data people in the room. Can you describe a little bit about what type of data is generated and how it is used, and maybe are there platforms or technologies that you've thought about that can help with that?
Well, the data that's generated really, depends somewhat on the assessment that folks are using. We initially intended to have a statewide platform where folks could access data from a variety of different sources. That, I don't know if you heard, but that didn't go so well in Rhode Island. So we don't actually have a statewide platform for data management. We do have a platform for managing this process. So the paperwork of SLOs all gets stored in a state-run database that was very rocky the first year, but in the second year has proved quite useful, so that folks write their SLOs, it gets stored in that database, and then they can kind of send it back and forth between the teacher and the evaluator within that system, send comments, and that sort of thing. So it actually isn't a data management system, but it helps support the eval process.
This is for accountability, you sort of frighten off the improvement side of it because no one believes you.
Yep.
Or if you don't have the accountability, people just say, well, this is a joke and I don't have to do it. So, I mean, you've been through it, you've been through the political battles, and so we just want to hear, what your favorite is.
Yeah, so what I will say is, in our system, you have to be, so there are multiple measures involved, not just SLOs, but also observations through professional practice and professional foundations or responsibilities for us. So there are a lot of pieces that go into a teacher's evaluation. That being said, when it all comes together, if you are rated ineffective, which is the lowest category, and you have to be low across all of these pieces in order to be ineffective, you actually have to be ineffective for 5 consecutive years before you would lose certification in the state of Rhode Island. So we don't really see that as that intense of a stick, and yet it is as if we had told everyone we were going to fire them tomorrow. And so it was very difficult to try and push the conversation to, it's about improvement. It's not really about, bringing you down in some way. The amount of people who were rated ineffective this past year is like in the dozens of across an entire state. And almost no one in the state earned the lowest rating on their SLO. So I think what we're seeing is there was probably some inflation because of probably there was inflation, obviously. But I think that's coming from the fear. And so that I see as this very, very long process to be able, if we can keep helping people realize and share some stories of people who said, this is what I set my SLO at, and I did all of this work because I thought it was going to be important for my kids, and I didn't get there. So what have I learned from this process? We haven't had people share as many of those stories, and I think that that's hurting the larger conversation across the state to see it as for improvement.
That was really where I'm coming from, because unless I'm just stupid, I'm not going to quit stretch school. This is what my colleague was talking about in Cincinnati. And so if I never pick a stretch goal, because I'm not stupid, I'm not going to be evaluated, even though, just like in Massachusetts, we're not quite as generous as Rhode Island, but I'm telling everyone, you're not going to lose your job over this. It's only the length of your cycle, 1 year, 2 years. That is viewed by teachers as a slap in the face if you don't get the 2 years.
Well,
but that's,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
But then that's where the extended conversations have to come in, between the principals and teachers and other teachers, and real honest conversations about, where are our kids getting? So whether that's, we've set these goals and everyone met their goals, but none of the kids were prepared to go on to the next grade, or none of the kids were prepared to go on to the middle school. I mean, the district has to be willing to have those conversations and at some point, this, whether it's cooking or baking, it has to come together to make something that you want, and that's why that's why I feel so strongly that this is part of the internal process, that the accountability has to be internal. Accountability belongs in the schools, and it can't be just from the state test. The state test plays a role and gives you some information, but this is building the culture of accountability in the schools where the teacher and the principal and the kids are. So it's going to take time, but...
And I also think alongside, if I were a teacher who felt alone, I would probably set lower targets too. But if I were a teacher who was part of a group of educators and I felt supported by my administrator to say, I'm going to set these stretch goals, but I know I have all these things going for me and going for my students along the way. There are these structures in place at our school that let me feel like I have tools and resources to use to actually get there. I think that's a very different feeling for some teachers in some schools than in others.
And just as across other states, you have to make sure your principal accountability system doesn't interfere with this or supports this, because people are working on that too. Just so we know, we have 2 minutes, and maybe we'll take one more question. But while people are listening and talking, can we fill out the yellow sheets if you get a chance? And you've been raising your hand from the beginning. So.
Yeah, I'd like to know, Jessica, you mentioned that there are other pieces as part of teacher evaluation. So this conversation this morning has focused on the measures of student learning. Mm-hmm. What about the measures of instructional effectiveness? It sounds like Rhode Island has put all of its eggs, or most of them, in the basket of SLOs.
So we have, we've adopted part of the Charlotte Danielson framework for our professional practice, and so teachers are observed in their classroom hopefully multiple times in the year, and there's a rubric that the state has adopted for our piece. We do have regulation that says that student learning needs to be, what is the correct language that we use? The majority. The majority.
Majority, yeah.
But we actually don't have percentages. We have a matrix, and so I know some states or districts have like 51% or 45%. We don't have that. So ours says, we took it on a profile basis to say, if your student learning is of the highest that it could be, and your practice that has been observed, your teaching practice is also the highest, then we think you should get the highest. If you're in the middle on both of these, it should be in the middle. And people really struggle with that in our state, but they definitely come together and influence each other.
And there has been lots of training on the other side too, and the state's invested in Teachscape, and and the principals calibrate it through summer training, and then again on their own they can calibrate through the Teachscape videos on the observation side. So there are as many measurement problems on the observation side as there are on this side, but one day at a time.
So I believe that ends our session. I appreciate I'm sure we all appreciate all of the participation that you guys have. I certainly can stay around for a little bit. I'm not sure about the rest of our guests. So I saw lots of questions if you want to come up and talk, but we want to let other people head out if they need to go to other sessions. So thank you.